closed the volume. That's probably why.
Yeah. Did you get the message recording in process?
I've clicked it.
Okay, good enough. So away we go. So we'll start off with some very basic background questions. Where were your parents born?
Well, my mother was born in Brownsburg, Quebec, which is a small rural community in Lower Laurentians, approximately 12 miles from Lachute, which is a town that most people may know. My father, I know very little about. I'm a war baby, but he was born in Ottawa, and he was a policeman in Ottawa before he went into the war. I never knew my father. He was injured, and my mother was pregnant, and they were to get married, and she was told he couldn't fill the bonds of a marriage. So I was raised in Ontario for the first year and a half of my life, because if you can imagine, back in those days, a young girl pregnant, not married, was a taboo. And she returned back home to Brownsburg when I was a year and a half, and I was raised, I really only know Brownsburg. So I was raised with my grandmother, my aunts and uncles and cousins there.
Okay, well, that kind of answers the second question, is about where you were born. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about your formative years and growing up.
I certainly can. I'm an only child. My mother never married. Was raised predominantly by my grandmother, for the simple reason, when I was a youngster, my mother worked at the CIL plant, and she did shift work. So it would be 8 to 4, 4 to midnight, midnight to 8. So when she was well, she would pay to board me in different families. But my mother suffered severely with anxiety and, well, now it's called bipolar, but manic depressive. And so she would be in and out of hospitals on a fairly regular basis. So she would use her health plan at work. There was no Medicare. She would use her savings. She had a brother who was a couple of years older than her, that they were extremely close. He had been a prisoner of war. He did not marry till he was 50. He would pick up the tab on her health care bills, and I would return to the family farm and be raised by my grandmother. So it's a little bit of juggling. My education, I say I was fortunate. I was in the generation where we went from kindergarten right up to grade 11 in the same building. So all the teachers knew us from the time we were little tykes till the time that we graduated from high school. So I enjoyed that part, and my school became really my network, my sports, my friends. And it was a very quiet life, put a lot of emphasis and importance into the family unit, my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, and my cousins.
Okay, so this school that you went to from kindergarten all the way to grade 11, that was in Brownsburg?
That was in Brownsburg, and it was called the Brownsburg High School.
Okay, and what about any post-secondary education?
No, I left the country because really you either worked at the CIL plant or you worked in retail. I left from high school and I came to Montreal, a green, naive kid, got off the train with my little suitcase and had an address to go to an aunt's sisters, an aunt through marriage. Their sisters in Park X. And in those good old days, we had policemen on the beat. And I guess he recognized that this is some green kid from somewhere. Where is she going? And he comes up to me and he says, "Can I help you?" "Well, I'm going to 7482 Wiseman." And I still remember the address. And he says, "Do you know where that is?" I said, "No." So he walked with me, and it was about 4 blocks away. Now, why the person did not meet me there is beyond me. But anyway, and he took me and he says, "Well, it's that building and it's up those stairs." So it was an upper duplex. I'd never seen one of them in my life. So I run up, he waits. And sure enough, the lady, Millie, came to the door, and the officer says, do you know this young lady? And she says, oh yes, it's my sister's niece. And so he let me stay.
Oh, what a great story.
Yeah, and my first job, she helped me find my first job, which was a mother's helper in Ville Saint Laurent for a Jewish family. And I did that, and then I went to night school. I did shorthand typing. And from that, I got a job at Bell Canada. And that started my first real job. And I can remember making $59 a week, and that was apparently very good money. And I got bored after about 3 years. I'm one of these people, I guess, even when I was shy and sort of out of my realm of security in the big city, I still got bored. And so I left that and I went and worked at the Douglas, well, it's now the Douglas Hospital. It was Verdun Protestant Hospital.
Yes.
And I took their specialized 1-year course. You could do it if you had grade 11. You could do it if you had grade 10 even. And so it was 6 months of theory and 6 months on the floor. And I lived in residence and I loved it. And I've done full cycle. My work was in the Porches Pavilion on the geriatric ward with the ladies.
Wow. What a great story.
It's interesting because I've been an advocate for the low income, the welfare, the anti-poverty movement, consumer protection, those kinds of things. But it's funny, I started, very close, raised by a grandmother. First job is, second job really, was with seniors. And, then I formed Seniors Action Quebec, and sort of the last end of my life and working volunteerism has been with seniors. So it's full cycle.
What a fascinating story. That really is. It's a heartwarming story in a lot of ways.
Oh, I enjoyed every moment of it. I still remember some of my patients' names.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And where do you live now, Ruth?
I live in Vaudreuil-Dorion. I pretty well lived, once I came to Montreal, I pretty well have spent most of my life in Ville Saint Laurent. And when I got married, I was in Laval, Chomedy, Laval West, de Montagne to mountains. But then when I divorced, I came back to Montreal because I was at CJD radio and I had to be at the station for 7 a.m. So it meant the commuting on the train, getting the 5:30 train and getting up at 4:30. And I still had two younger teenagers in the house. So I did that for about 1.5 years. And I said, no, I've got to move closer. So I came back to Saint Laurent. Then about 8 years ago, it'll be 9 years this coming June. So 8.5 years ago, I moved to Vaudreuil-Dorion. I couldn't afford the rents in downtown Montreal.
Was that the primary reason for moving off the island?
Well, it certainly was right up there with number one. I had a sweetheart deal with an upper duplex, a big 7.5, year-round solarium, loved it. I was alone upstairs. The owner was a lady working for the federal government on her own. So no fights, no parties, no nothing. So it was very peaceful. I had a sweetheart deal as far as rent. I'd been there 14 years. She raised me after the first year, $10. And that was the only raise I ever had because she figured she had a quiet tenant and she was going to hold on to me. But then I started with arthritis and joints and, hip and knee replacements and that, and breathing issues. And the doctor said, this upper duplex we don't think is the best. So I told her I was moving and she sold that place within 3 weeks. She said, I'm not dealing with tenants. She'd been spoiled. She'd had her mom above her, then she'd had a stepdaughter above her, and then me. And I looked, and the rents were just astronomical because by this time I had retired. And I always predominantly worked nonprofit. Like, okay, I worked at Bell, but I didn't work at Bell to have a pension. I didn't work long enough at the Verdun Protestant to have a pension. So most of my jobs were nonprofit and no pension. And I'd save for RSP, but my husband, before we divorced, hadn't worked for like 7 years. So all the savings were cashed in. You know, I said, I can't do it. I can't pay this $1,200, $1,500 rents. So my youngest child, bought a condo out here. And I went from a 7.5 to a 3.5. And I said, I'll never make it, but I did. And I have enough room for everything. I probably could even downsize a bit more. And it's new. And they took all their investments and put it in, and they look at it as an investment. And so I was able, they kept the rent. It's what I was paying at Celeron. So I got a sweetheart deal, but I'm far removed from all the action.
And probably grateful for that too, I bet.
Oh, I don't know. Sometimes I get a little bored.
Yeah. Well, that's great. What a great background story, Ruth. And I think what we'll do is we'll move right into the kind of the focus of what we're after here is your experience in living in Quebec. Now, you've alluded to it in some of the questions I've asked, but I'm going to ask you more specific questions now. For example, the first question I'd like to ask is, what is the best thing for you about living in Quebec?
I would say for me, it's my personal history of family and my ancestors. It's my networks, my support networks of friends and colleagues that I've built connections with, and I've maintained them throughout the years. I never shut a door, and in fact, several of my jobs I've even returned and worked at them the second time around. So to me, that's very important, and perhaps that's part of my upbringing, being an only child and being in the country, because it wasn't electricity, there wasn't running water, so no TV, no phones. So I put great importance to my people connections. And to me, I look at it as a support mechanism. But there's something above and beyond that. Quebec has a joie de vivre. Well, being from the country, I guess we like the good meals and the good food. So certainly the Quebecois are like that. I love music. So to me, two things to break the barriers. It's a good meal, food and music. So I like the atmosphere of Quebec. My French is comme ci, comme ça, je parle un peu, mais c'est pas parfait, pantoute. Mais j'étais une personne qui essayait de parler français avec tout le monde. So I always try to speak French. And I've always been accepted for my efforts to speak French. I've never been ridiculed, and it certainly is not perfect. But my children are fluently bilingual. They did half their schooling in French and half in English. And when I say French, I'm not talking French immersion. I'm talking the real French system. And my grandchildren are completely bilingual. I think that's one of the reasons I like Quebec and I want to stay. And of course, my kids, I'm fortunate, my kids are all still here. But some of the nonsense that comes up rears its ugly head every so often. I say enough is enough.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, further to that point, how would you describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word, if you had to?
Oh my goodness gracious. Are you talking about my overall feeling, or you're talking about what I'm thinking about Quebec at the current moment?
Either or. When you think of Quebec and your relationship to it, what's the first word that comes to your mind?
I would say home.
Okay, that fair enough. That's a great answer. Okay.
Currently, I don't know if I can put it in only one word. Anxious, disappointed, fed up.
Right.
Of the current situation, because I find it needless.
Yes. Okay. Where do you feel most at home in Quebec? I mean, you've alluded to your past. You've talked about where you live now. In the totality of your life, where have you felt most at home?
I would say I probably feel more at home when I'm involved, either as a volunteer or as a working person, in the broader community. Can be English, French, cultural communities, doesn't matter. Working to make a difference and improvement. And I don't shy away from the political side, be it federal or provincial. So I'm probably more in my niche in those aspects.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, along those lines, how would you define a Quebecer? What is a Quebecer in your mind?
I would say, in my mind, a Quebecer is someone who relates to the province, who appreciates the majority community, what it has to offer, the different cultural aspects to Quebec society. I find that the majority French-speaking Quebecer has a great affinity for family, for children. They have, I guess it's probably the joie vivre, but a very open, laid back attitude generally, like they're not stiff at all. But there's certain aspects to it that I don't care for, but.
Okay, well, let me ask a follow-up to that. Do you think that the official definition in Quebec includes you? I guess what the government or the establishment would call a Quebecer. Does that include you? Do you feel that way?
I don't feel that this current government includes me, no. And periodically over the last, I'd say 30, 40 years, there's been times that I felt it didn't include me. They tolerate me. We're taxpayers, we work. We've been around a long time, so you know, they'll turn the other cheek per se. But I find recently it's more negative, less open, I find, to accepting our contributions and our role in Quebec society. I mean, and it's sort of bizarre because we're probably getting more English spoken from the current politicians and the current government party, CAC, than we ever got. But I look at it as completely phony. There's a purpose to it. It's cunning, it's sly. I have a feeling that I'm not a historic Anglophone. I don't want to be put in that category. My family worked. My family was never one of these wealthy Anglo-Saxons. They ran a farm. They had 12 kids. They worked the farm. They all worked hard. I was raised with a family that didn't go and take social benefits per se. You lived with what you were able to make. They paid their taxes. They were law-abiding citizens. And I resent it terribly to feel that, well, now you're just, and I respect the majority. I respect the fact that the majority population is French speaking, and I make every effort to do so. But I happen to work in English, and there are older seniors than myself who, and I'll speak for the women, didn't have the opportunities to even be out in the workplace. So they've got even less English, perhaps. And even if I was a fluently bilingual, could write reports in French, I have a fundamental problem of limiting my services, my options to services, and addressing my needs as a Quebecer. Should I become ill? Should I have a stroke? Should a young person who is fluently bilingual be in a horrific accident, have psychological mental health issues, and they cannot get service in their language? I just cannot accept it.
Well, I think you've answered the next question quite a bit, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just to put some context to what you've said. So has your sense of identity as a Quebecer changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
Yes, it has. You know, I was in the war room during the two referendums, and I worked very hard to make sure that we got the vote out and that we realized what was at risk if Quebec should separate. And I felt that we had more champions during that time that were prepared to put the facts on the table to the Quebec separatist movement. It'll be democratic. There will be a vote. And if you win, yes, you separate. But all the federal institutions, the federal employees that wish to, will remove themselves from the province of Quebec. I feel that we do not have that protection, or that those ambassadors really out there now, voicing the two sides to the coin. So people make an extremely important decision. So we got through the two referendums and things seemed to stabilize, and the English continued. They got their children were, you know, brought up to speak both languages. The young are fluently bilingual. I mean, you know, many of them would probably say, well, it's not our fight, it's our parents' fight, our grandparents' fight. But some of the young people are now seeing what's happening to their educational system and their CEGEPs and saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. We have a right to make a decision and choose. So, you know, there's that. So we had a few years of what I would say calm, peaceful. I don't agree with the l'Office de langue française and these inspectors, but it is a fact. So, you know, you live with it. But then all of a sudden, to be almost thrown, well, we're thrown back into the mess again. And I would say it's even more dangerous this time around. Because there is no campaign, there's no public hearings, discussions. You've got a government that's got a majority that is very cunning, very sly, and has implemented laws and restrictive laws, invoked a notwithstanding clause, so it basically ends all discussion, all dialogue, all modification. And we're not even going to go in the ballot box. So I have a serious issue with that. And I feel that what it's done, we're dealing with a healthcare system that's in crisis. We're dealing with an education system that's struggling. We're dealing with inflation. We're dealing with a pandemic. We're dealing with a housing crisis. There's enough on our plates with the bread and butter issues that to have this on top of it is extremely stressful. It's caused a lot of concern among seniors. It's just dreadful what it's done to seniors. And I find that we've got much more important things that we should be addressing. And yet I look at society as a whole in Quebec and no, okay, we have the QCGN and they're having their briefs and their sessions, and the lawyers are involved, and it will be challenged in the Supreme Court of Canada, I'm sure. But where is the grassroots opposition to this? I don't hear too much. And that concerns me. And I don't want to go back to the and raise the ire and get people's backs up. But I think that we're on a slippery slope, and it's probably 98% the horses are out of the barn. And I don't know how we're going to attach them to the wagons.
Well, I think you probably, as with many of these questions, you probably answered a good part of the next one, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec?
I would say the political issues of language and the constant threat, concern of the l'Office de langue française coming down on small businesses. Can we not come to some form of agreement that we respect each other? Each group has a role to play for the benefit of Quebec. I'm not interested in putting Quebec in the gutter. Take away the language issues, and I would say that every family is interested in having a job, having decent housing, having a decent salary, decent education, healthcare, and decent retirement, and a place for their grandparents or their elderly to live that's safe and secure and decent, they're not going to be abused or neglected. And can we move on? Can we move on? Because this is a waste of everybody's energy and time, and it's not productive.
Okay, very good. And drilling down a little bit, the next question is, in recent years, Quebec's Francophone majority has identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you share and support? And which of these concerns make you feel excluded or targeted?
Well, I would say that the constant rhetoric that we get from the current government that, French is in jeopardy. They're going to lose their French language, their French culture. Your culture and your language is what you maintain amongst yourself, your social networks, your home, your family. In my humble opinion, you are the majority. You are not a victim. Stop playing the victim role. And I would say that where this rhetoric is being played out is in rural Quebec, where they don't have the same employment opportunities. They don't seem to do, some do. I shouldn't generalize. But are the opportunities for travel and to see how the rest of the world is and how the greater Montreal area functions and business functions and the need for the English language. The limitations that they put on the cultural communities when they arrive. We want immigration. We want people paying into our tax fund. Otherwise, the people who are 30, 40, and 50 may not have a pension plan because each generation pays for the generation behind, so we need the taxpayers paying now. There's the non-acceptance of systemic discrimination and the refusal to accept that exists. That's a concern. So there's some serious flaws, I think, that have to be addressed, or more education, sensitizing has to be done.
Well, that leads me to the next question, which you may have already answered. And what is the biggest problem facing Quebec today? And how do you feel it could be resolved?
Well, if we're talking strictly language, but there's a malaise, I think, all over society as a whole. Like climate change is everywhere. lack of people wanting to work seems to be an issue in many places. But for Quebec society, and let's say Bill 96 and how it treats its citizens, there's a couple of serious threats. And I don't know, I can't probably put them in order of priority because to me, they're all almost equally important. This constant Quebec society feeling inferior unless they restrict the rights and the opportunities for the minorities within their province has got to be addressed. There is a malaise within the community that feels that way within the Francophone community. And I don't know if it's propaganda. I don't know if it's false news. It's a steady diet of this fearful messaging that is being given to people. Because even Lucien Bouchard at the Centaur Theatre, who was a federal minister, Secretary of State, then he became the leader of PKIST, and the Premier of Quebec, stood in the Centaur Theatre and said, you go to the hospital for a blood test, you don't go to the hospital for a language test. You know, I think if you ask any Anglophone that's living in Quebec how they felt about René Lévesque, almost every one of us liked the gentleman, respected the gentleman. Our politics were not the same. We did not believe the same thing. But he was a straight shooter. He was open to listening. I think he was a gentleman that thoroughly enjoyed people. He had an agenda and he had a goal, but he wasn't prepared to do it on, you know, by slicing everybody at the knees, chopping them at the knees. Quebec society or Quebec government leaders have got to find the confidence that they've got enough security within their own souls that they can move forward economically, language-wise, without putting other people down and restricting other people, because it's going to have serious consequences on the economics of the province. The best and the brightest and those who are mobile are going to leave. They're not going to stay here and deal with this on an ongoing basis. Why would they? They don't need to. We've got to be able to attract healthcare professionals, teachers. We've got a serious situation of making contracts, working agreements, working conditions, the educational system for our professionals much more appealing so that people want to get into these fields, because we're in serious trouble with our teachers and our nurses and doctors. And we've got a serious housing issue. So we've got plenty that the government should be looking at. And I probably have not answered your question.
No, you've answered the question very, very well. And that being a very general and broad-ranging question, I think in some of your previous responses, you certainly covered off what we were asking. To make it a little simpler and maybe actually a little more difficult, I'm going to ask you a very pointed question. On a scale from 1 to 10, indicate by a show of fingers, that's visually for us, how strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges of living in Quebec?
So they outweigh. I can't even say if it's tiff-tiff.
No, show a show of hands, a show of fingers. Very good. Excellent. Okay.
And I'm being generous.
Okay, fair enough. Now, is there anything else that you would like to say about your sense of identity or belonging living in Quebec?
Well, I'll say a few words, and it's for myself, but I'm also going to say it on behalf of the seniors who have called me and emailed me. Quebec is our home. We've contributed to Quebec society. We like the French Quebec speaking citizens. We don't have a hatred to them. Quebec, we feel we want to contribute. We feel we have contributed. We always felt, I personally, all the way along, even until like 1970, had no issue at all, got along fine, spoke my broken French, spoke English, back and forth. Always felt like, oh, I'm home. There was no doubt, no question, nothing. Had a few years of peace and don't want to go through this anymore. And my sense of belonging at this age in my life and this stage, I don't want to be dealing with this. I want to be accepted for what I can offer. And maybe it's getting less and less, but I still try. I want to be able to live whatever time I've got left in peace. We have enough with the climate change and what we see on the news, and God forbid the war in Ukraine. So can we move on and maybe, take the bloody armor off and start to get to know each other as human beings and as people trying to raise a family, take care of their elderly, and do the best they can in what we're dealing with as an overall society.
Very wise words, Ruth, and thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. And
well, it was my pleasure. I hope it helps, and it was a delight to get to meet you.
oh, thank you.